Welcome to this section. In this section, we're going to create a quiz application. We'll utilize some of what we've learned in the past few sections by breaking our app down into components. We'll throw in some animations to make things more exciting. It's going to be a lot of fun, so I hope you're ready. We're going to need to prepare the project. I've gone ahead with preparing some starter files. In the resource section of this lecture, you'll find a zip file with everything you'll need. There are a total of 3 files, which are app.txt, data.txt, and css.txt. Keep the zip file in handy. We'll need it in just a moment. Pause the video and download it. I'm providing starter files because I want to focus solely on Vue. The zip file contains HTML, CSS, and some data. We'll need to create a new project. In the command line, run the following command. This command will start a new project. The name of the project should be called Quiz. As usual, select No for all questions. After a while, a new project should be generated. Move into the project directory after Vue is finished downloading everything. Next, let's install the dependencies with the npm install command. It's not necessary to have some of the default code you'll find in the project. For example, the files in the components directory can be emptied out. I'll do that now. The code in the app component file can be reduced too. We'll empty out the 3 blocks in the component. Lastly, let's export an object from the script block with a property called name. The name of the component will be called app. Your app component file should look similar to mine. Other than making these changes, we'll be good to go. Our first objective is to add in the HTML and CSS we downloaded from the zip file. They have the overall structure and styles we'll be aiming for in this section. We'll start with the HTML. Inside the app.txt file, you'll find some basic HTML markup. Nothing in here is related to Vue. I haven't added any directives or expressions to it. Those are things we'll add later. Copy everything inside the text file. Paste the code you've copied into the template block of the app component. Next, we need to add in the CSS. There are 2 options available to us. We can add the CSS to the CSS block in the component file. The second option is to load the CSS in an external file. Either solution is valid. It's completely up to you. The first option is the easiest because it's just a copy and paste. However, I feel like this will be a great opportunity to show you how to load an external CSS file. It's not hard at all. Neither solution is wrong, but we'll be looking at how to put CSS in one file. We don't need component-specific CSS at this time. Navigate to the public directory in the project. Any files we create inside this directory will ship with our application. They won't be bundled into a single file, but you can still deploy them with your application. We'll create a file called main.css. The contents of the file will be filled with the code inside the css.txt file. It's very basic CSS. Nothing in this file should be anything new to you. With that set, let's preview what we have. I have my app running using the npm run dev command. Upon refreshing the page, you should have what I have. It's a basic quiz app with some dummy questions and answers. We even have a dummy result below. There's a progress bar to let the user know how far they are into the quiz. We'll be using components and animations to make this look nice. Keep in mind, this is one way of handling static assets. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the static assets handling documentation page. There's more information you'll find on this page about including static assets. I recommend reading it over. We'll definitely talk about some of this stuff as the course progresses. The HTML and CSS are ready. The next step is to add Vue into the mix. We'll cover that in the following lecture. In the previous lecture, we prepped the application by adding in the HTML and CSS. The next step is to add the logic for making the quiz application functional. There are a lot of things we'll want to make functional. It can seem overwhelming at first. It's always good practice to break things into smaller pieces. Let's examine the HTML structure for a moment to decide on how to break things down. There are two main sections, which are the questions, container, and result. It would make sense to put these sections into separate components. We'll need to communicate down the data to these components. It's clear that they'll hold different types of content, one for questions and another for the results. Let's put both sections into their separate components. Inside the components directory, create two files called questions.vue and result.vue. We'll add the template and script blocks to both components. We're going to cut the div tag with the class of questions container from the app component file. This includes all of its contents. Then, we'll paste the code we've copied into the template block of the questions component. Up next, we'll need to grab the HTML for the result component. Go back to the app component file, cut the div tag with the class of result. We'll paste this into the template block of the result component. The first step we'll usually take when developing applications is to break things down into small components. We've identified that there are sections for the quiz application. There are the questions, and then there are the results. We've put them into separate components to make things easier to manage and organize. The next step is to prepare the data. After we have the data in hand, we'll want to pass down the data to any components that need them. Currently, we don't have any data. The zip file you downloaded in the previous lecture will contain a file called data.txt. To save some time, I've provided you with some initial data. Copy everything inside this file. Then switch over to the app component file. Inside the exported object, define the data function. We're going to return the object we copied. We've copied over a lot of data. Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it looks. If we minimize some of the items in the object, we'll find two arrays. We have the questions array and the results array. The questions array is an array of objects. Each object has a question and an array of possible answers. Each answer is an object with the answer. There's a property called isCorrect. The isCorrect property will tell the application if the answer is correct. There are a total of 3 questions. Feel free to modify the questions to whatever you like or add more. We'll leave it at 3 to keep it simple. Moving on over to the results array, we'll find another array of objects. This one is a little simpler this time. Each object has 4 properties. The minimum and maximum properties will be used to help us figure out what results to display. We'll use it by checking how many answers the user has answered correctly. In addition, we have the title and description properties. There are a total of 2 results. That's basically it. We're going to add more data throughout the development of the project. This is to start us off. We're going to minimize both objects. One thing to note is that I'm adding this data to the app component as opposed to their respective components. This placement is common practice. You want to add your data to the parent component and pass it down. That doesn't mean that children components can't have their own data. Any data deemed necessary should be placed at the top level. Before we can pass the data, we need to register the components. At the top of the script block, we'll import both components. Next, we'll create the components property and register both components locally. We've called the components questions and result, respectively. With the components registered, we're going to load them inside the template block. We're loading them in where they were previously placed in the template. This should result in what we had before. Before we proceed any further, let's make sure things work. If you haven't already, start your server with the npm run dev command. In the browser, you will still see the static content we had before. We've confirmed that everything is working so far. The next step is to make it so that both components don't appear together. It doesn't make much sense for both to appear at the same time. We want to render the results after the user has completed the quiz. We'll make it so that the questions appear first before we display the result. First, we'll need to keep track of how many questions the user has answered. Inside the app component, we'll create a data property to keep track of that. Create a property called questions answered with a default value of 0. We'll assume the user hasn't answered any questions. Inside the template block, we're going to apply the if directive to the questions component. The condition we'll check will be the following: questions answered less than questions.length. We're saying that if the number of questions answered is less than the number of questions available, then show the questions component. Otherwise, show the results. This won't work yet because we need to apply the else directive to the result component. Let's review if this works. Inside the browser, the questions component should be the only component rendering. It works, but before we move on, I want to make sure the conditional directives work. Open the Vue Developer Tools. We'll want to view the data for the app component. We're going to increment the questions answered property. As I do so, the questions component will be swapped with the result component. This switch will occur if 3 or more questions are answered, since that's how many questions we have in the array. Great, we've verified everything is working so far. We're going to reset this back to 0. We're able to toggle between both components. The next part is to make the questions component functional. Let's think about this for a moment. What should happen when a user answers a question? How do we keep track of what question the user is on? How do we display the current active question? There are a lot of questions we have to answer. You can tackle this in several ways. Remember that there's no absolute way to do things in Vue. Vue is very flexible and offers many methods for doing the same thing. The following is my solution and how I would go about doing this. First, we have to loop through the questions and render them. We want to present one question at a time. Therefore, we'll have to store the index of the current active question. We'll use the index to determine whether or not a question should be visible. Afterward, we'll listen for click events on the answers. If an answer is selected, then we'll check if that is the correct answer. If it is, we'll keep track of how many questions the user has answered correctly. We'll need to update the number of questions answered and move on to the next one. This is the overall process. If it doesn't make complete sense, then that's fine. We'll be going through it together when building the quiz app. In accordance with the process, we'll loop through the questions. The questions component currently doesn't have the questions. This is because the question data is stored in the app component. We'll need to pass it down as a property. Inside the app component, we'll apply an attribute called questions. This will be bound to the questions array. We'll need to accept the questions passed down from the parent component. Switching to the questions component, we'll add the props property. We won't bother with validation to keep things simple. If you want to validate the props, then go for it. We'll add the questions prop to the array. After providing the questions to the component, we can loop through them. Inside the template block, we'll find a div tag with the class of single question. We'll want to perform a loop on this element. We'll add the v_for directive to it. We'll set the expression to question in questions, where question is the alias name we'll use for the question in the current iteration. To prevent any funny business, we'll bind the key attribute to question.q. This attribute is to make sure nothing strange happens. The Q property is the property that holds the actual question itself. It's unique enough for our case. The last thing we need to do is replace the static text with expressions. The text inside the div tag with the class of question should be replaced with the expression question.q. The answers are stored in an array. We'll have to loop through them as well. Inside the div tag with the class of answers will be another set of div tags with dummy answers. We'll be using this element to loop through the answers. It isn't necessary to have so many dummy answers. We can keep one and remove the rest. Then, we'll add the v4 directive to the one we left with the expression set to answer in question.answers. Each object in the array has a property called text. We'll use the expression answer.text to replace the static text inside the div. I almost forgot. We should also bind the key attribute inside the loop. We'll use the text property for its value. Let's make one final preview before moving on. Refresh the app in the browser. Vue is looping through the questions. Each question has its answers outputted. We still need to make it so that only one question appears, but we'll get to that in the next lecture. To review everything we did so far, we created two components, one for the questions and another for the results. We then passed down the data from the app component to the questions component. Lastly, we looped through all the questions and answers in our data. If you made it this far, then congrats. We've still got a ways to go, so I'll see you in the next lecture. According to this plan, the next step is to output the question the user is currently on. Any other question should be hidden from view. We can do this by keeping track of the index. We can use a conditional directive to instruct Vue to display a question with a specific index. You'll see how it works in just a moment. Coincidentally, inside the app component, we have a property called QuestionsAnswered set to 0. We can use this property to represent the current index as well. We want the quiz to start on the first question. As you know, the first index in an array is 0. If the user answers a question, then the QuestionsAnswered property would increment by 1, moving us along to the next question. All we have to do is pass it down to the questions component. On the questions component, we'll call the attribute QuestionsAnswered and bind it. Switching over to the questions component, we'll accept this in the props array. With access to the index of the current question, we'll need the index from the questions in general. This way, we can compare the indexes. Any index that matches the index of the current question will be shown. Inside the loop for the questions, we're going to update this expression to be question QI. QI being short for question index. We're going to add another directive to this called the vShow directive. The condition we'll be using will be the following. Question index equals QI. We're checking if the current index in the loop matches the index we have in the data. If it's a match, then we want the question to be visible. Otherwise, we'll hide it. The reason I'm using vShow instead of vIf is because questions can go by quickly. The vIf directive would work well in this case, but just to make sure, the vShow directive is more performant in this case. If I were to switch over the browser, we'd find only one question displaying, which is the first question. We'll need a way to update the index, or else we'll always display the same question. Before we can do that, we need to listen for clicks events on the answers. We don't want to update the index until the user has answered the question. Go back to the editor. Inside the loop, we'll listen for the click event on the div tag with the class of answer with the prevent modifier. The name of the function we'll want to call is selectAnswer. We want to send a few things to this function. We're going to need to tell the function whether the answer the user selected is correct or incorrect. We'll pass in the value answer.isCorrect. This is a Boolean value. You can find this value in each answer object. We'll leave it at that for now. Let's define the function next. Add the methods property to the exported object below. Inside it, define the function. In the function's parameters, we're expecting a value called isCorrect. Even though we're passing it in, we're not going to check if the answer is correct in this function. Instead, we want to do that inside the app component. The reason being is that we want to keep track of the correct answers in the app component. This way, we can pass down the number of correct answers to the result component. The result component is responsible for displaying the user's results. We need to pass this value up to the app component. We can do that by emitting an event. The function we'll need to call is the this.$emit function. The first parameter is the name of the event. We'll call the event questionAnswered. We want to pass on the Boolean value we received in the function. Vue requires we add the emits option. This option lets it know what custom events will be emitted from the component. The value will be an array of custom event names. We'll add the questionAnswered event to it. After emitting an event, we'll need to listen for it on the app component. Switching to the app component file, we'll add the event listener to the questions component in the template. We're calling the function the same name as the event. Not necessary, but I like to keep things consistent. We'll need to create the methods object down below and define the function. In the function, we're accepting the value emitted from the event. With the value, we can check if the answer is correct. If it is, we can tally that with the number of correct answers the user has made. If it isn't, we'll do nothing and leave the total as is. We'll keep track of how many questions the user has answered correctly in the component. Inside the data object, we're going to create a new property called totalCorrect assigned to the value of 0. If the answer is correct, this is the value we'll want to update. Back inside the function, we'll create a conditional statement with the isCorrect argument as the condition. If the value turns out to be true, we'll update the totalCorrect data property by incrementing it. Let's review the steps we've taken so far. We've looped through the questions and rendered them. We're keeping track of the current active question, listening for click events on the answers, and checking if the answer is correct. If the answer is correct, we're keeping track of how many questions the user has answered correctly. According to the plan, the next step is to update the number of questions answered. This will allow us to move on to the next question. Here's where we can kill two birds with one stone. We're already keeping track of how many questions have been answered. We're also using it to keep track of the active question. The only thing we need to do is increment it. Inside the questions answered function, we'll increment the questions answered data property. If we did everything correctly, then we will be able to click on any of the answers. Refresh the page to test if this is true. It doesn't matter if the answer is correct or not. The next question should pop up immediately afterward. Eventually, after answering 3 questions, the result should pop up. It's a dummy result, but it's good to know we're still able to switch over once all questions have been answered. We're almost done. We'll refresh the page again. I want you to notice we have a progress bar at the top. It would be nice to let the user know how many questions they've answered and how many are left. Let's make this part of the app functional. Back inside the questions component, we can use the data we already have to make this work. The progress bar can be found at the div tag with the class of progress. There are two divs, one for the actual bar and another for the text inside the bar. We'll start with the text. It says the following: 1 out of 3 questions answered. We'll replace the first number with the expression questions answered. The second number should be replaced with the expression questions.length. Next up is the bar. The CSS for the progress bar is already ready. We can find the styles in the CSS file we created earlier for this project. We can make the progress bar functional by changing its width. It needs to be dynamic. We can do this by binding the style attribute on the div tag with the class of bar. We're going to set this to an object. We'll add the width property because we want to change it. The value for this will be quite long, so bear with me here. The value for this will be the following: questions answered / questions.length asterisk 100+%. We're dividing the number of questions answered by the total number of questions. This calculation will give us the percentage, but it will be in decimals. We can multiply it by 100 to give a more accurate percentage value. Lastly, we add the percent symbol as the unit of measurement. Alright, let's give things a test. Upon refreshing the page, the progress bar is empty. It's starting at 0. If we were to select an answer, then the bar will increase its width appropriately, eventually reaching 100% if all questions are answered. You'll notice that there's a smooth animation playing while it increases in size. This animation isn't Vue related. We're not using a transition component. This is how CSS functions whenever a property changes. If you were to view the style sheet file, you'd find the bar class with the transition property. We don't need to use the transition component to get this animation because the transition component only works on elements that enter or leave the document. If you're just changing other properties, then using CSS on its own will suffice. We don't need to use the transition component every time we want to add an animation. We will be using the transition components soon to animate between questions and results. We'll take care of that in the next lecture. We're almost finished with the quiz application. The last thing we need to do is to calculate the result. After calculating the results, we can transition to the result from the final question. We'll also make the reset button functional for resetting the quiz. Let's get started. We need to pass down the data to the result component. The results are stored in the app component. We can't display the result if we don't have the data. There are two things it's going to need: the list of results available and the total number of correct answers. We'll pass down both properties to the result component from the app component in the template block. We'll call the attributes results and total correct. We're passing in their respective values. We can switch over to the result component and accept both properties with the props property. After accepting both properties, we have to figure out how to output the appropriate result. Each result in the array has a minimum and maximum requirement for the number of questions the user should have answered correctly. If the requirements are met, then the result should render on the page. We'll need to loop through each of the results. During each iteration, we'll compare the total correct property to the min and max properties. We'll need to store the result that meets both requirements after we've looped through all the results. This situation would be a great use case of computed properties. We'll create the computed object inside the script block of the result component. we'll create a computed property called result_index. Inside this function, we'll create a variable called index assigned to 0. We'll want to return it. We're going to assume the first result should be the default result. We'll need to loop through the results. On each iteration, we'll compare each minimum and maximum value with the total number of correct answers the user has. There are various functions we can use to loop through the results. For this project, we'll use the forEach function. We'll call that from the this.results object. Any props we accept from the parent component can be accessed via the this keyword. It's proxied by Vue automatically. You can use any looping function you want, as there are several, as long as you're able to loop through the array. We'll pass in an arrow function. We'll call the parameters e and I. The e represents the current item in the iteration of the array. The I is the index. Inside this loop, we'll create a conditional statement that will check the following: e.min less than or equal to this.total correct, and e.max greater than or equal to this.total correct. It's a long condition. Let me break it down. We're checking if the total number of correct answers is above the minimum and that it's also below the maximum. If both conditions turn out to be true, then we found a result for the user. Therefore, we need to update the index. We'll set the index variable to the parameter I since it represents the current index in the loop. There isn't anything else we need to do in the function. One of the things I like about this solution is that we're using a computed property. The only time this function executes if either the results or total correct properties updates. If a user guesses an answer incorrectly, then this function will not run again. We are saving on performance and time. The index for the correct result is ready. The next step is to display the result. Inside the template, there are two things we'll need to change: the title and description. Inside the div tag with class of title, we'll replace the static text with the expression results index.title. We'll do the same for the description, except this time the expression will be results index.desc. Keep in mind that I'm grabbing these properties from the result object found in the results array. Every object has the same properties. We shouldn't encounter any unexpected errors. Be sure to look at each object to understand better what you can expect when the quiz is completed. The first result will be selected if the total is above 0 and below 2. The last result will be selected if the total is 3. This means that the user either passes the quiz or fails it. Not very exciting, but it should work for demonstration purposes. The last thing we'll do in our application is reset the quiz if the user clicks on the button in the app component file. The button can be found at the bottom of the template. If the button is clicked, we'll need to update two properties to give the illusion the quiz has been reset. First, we need to reset the questions answered property to 0. Since we're starting from the beginning, the number of questions the user has answered will need to start 0. Secondly, we'll reset the total correct property to 0. The user's score will be reset too. Let's begin. In the app component file, we'll add a click event listener to the button with the prevent modifier. The name of the function we'll run will be called reset. This method doesn't exist in our component. Let's add it to the methods object. In this method, we'll set the questions answered and total correct properties to 0. We don't need to do anything else. These two properties are really all it takes to reset the quiz. There's one more adjustment we can make. The button we have in the template will always appear. We'll want to hide it because we don't want the user to retake the quiz until they've completed it. Back in the template, we'll add a if directive to the element. The condition we'll write will check if the questions answered property is equal to the questions.length property. After making that change, we're finished with the quiz app. Switch over to the browser and refresh. I'm going to attempt to fail this quiz. If everything works, we will see the first result telling us that we should study and retake the quiz. This should be the expected result since we meet all the minimum and maximum requirements. It's not a hard quiz. You shouldn't have any problems with it either. This time, the second result will display telling us that we're a bunch of geniuses. Fantastic! We have a functional quiz app. We could leave it like this and call it a day, but I would like to take things a step further. I believe animations can make things a whole lot smoother. Why don't you give this a try? Apply an animation between each question answered and another animation between the questions and result components. I've already provided the CSS for this. The name of your animation should be called Fade. Pause the video and good luck. Welcome back. If you were able to accomplish this, then congrats. If not, that's fine as well. We'll do it together. The solution is quite simple. Let's start with the questions. Search for the div tag with the class of single question. It's the same div tag with the v-for directive applied to it. Wrap this element with the transition group component. We're using the transition group component because it handles transitioning a list of items. We'll want to set the name of the animation. We'll add the name attribute. The name of our animations will be called Fade. The Fade classes are already provided with the CSS file we added earlier. We'll examine it soon, but let's move on to animating the questions and result components. Switch to the app component file. We're going to wrap the transition component around both components. The transition group component is not necessary for a task like this. The transition component will suffice. We'll use the same set of animations as last time. We'll add the name attribute with a value of Fade. We'll also add the mode attribute with a value of OutIn. This mode will make sure the questions component animates out before the result component animates in. It'll make our animations look smoother. Before we preview what this will look like, let's review the CSS. Open the CSS file and scroll down to the bottom. We have the usual Fade classes with their enter and leave states. In the classes, we're modifying the opacity and transition properties to achieve this effect. It's the same code we used in the animation section of this course. Alright, let's preview this. Refresh the page for a fresh start. I'll go through the quiz. As I do so, the animation plays nice and smoothly. Everything is transitioning like we want it. Even the transition between questions and results is working. You shouldn't be receiving any errors in the console. Congratulations! We've successfully created a functioning quiz application. It's very basic, but we applied a lot of what we have learned in this course. We separated everything into its own component. We passed down data to children components, added animations, and efficiently kept track of everything. Take the time to review the code we wrote. Add some comments if it helps. When you're ready, I'll see you in the next section.
Hey everybody, I want to take a quick break here. Go grab a coffee, grab a tea, just take a break from all the learning that you just did. And I want to talk to you quickly about imposter syndrome. It's this idea that you're not good enough, that things are too complicated for you to ever achieve what you want to achieve. You look at other people, at other industry experts and you say, I will never get there. But it's just a symptom of learning. This idea of you not being good enough simply means that, well, you're just not there yet. Things take time. If you want to learn a valuable skill, well, it's hard work. That's why it's valuable. Remember how you felt on the first day of going to school, first day on a job. It's the same experience. But over time, with repetition, with practice, you get comfortable, you get experience, and you slowly start to lose that imposter syndrome. Now, this idea of an imposter syndrome is great. It means you're doing something worthwhile. So don't use it as a negative. Use it as an encouragement that you're doing something good, that you're learning and you're stretching your limits. So with this break, I want to propose that we do a quick exercise. I want you to stop the lectures. Again, grab a coffee, grab a tea, and head on over to our Discord. Now, in our Discord server, if you've used it up until now, that's great. If you haven't, head on over to this server, and I want you to do something that I think it's super important to learning. And that is using what you've learned up until now to actually teach someone or help someone. So you can go all the way to, let's say, the coding and courses section and pick a topic that you want to help somebody in. So let's say you go to the Python channel. And in here, you'll have other students that are asking Python related questions. Now you can scroll through here and see if you're able to help someone. Even though you may not have the experience or the knowledge yet, this idea of practicing and explaining what you've just learned to other people, even if you're not 100% certain, actually is beneficial to your learning. Because if you're never teaching, if you're never explaining and vocalizing and showing what you've learned, you'll always be a beginner. This idea of teaching what you learn is a very important concept. So moving forward, as you go through the lectures, anytime you feel like taking a break, hop on over to Discord and help somebody. Our motto here is that we're always kind. We don't judge anybody. We're all just beginners here. We're all learning. So don't be afraid to answer things because you got to remember, nobody's perfect except for Yoda. Yoda is pretty perfect. All right. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.